myself. And okay, so we are now recording. We've got our AGM has wrapped up, and we're welcoming our delegates who have been coming from the AGM, as well as many of our donors and community leaders. So hi, Tara. Hi, Keith. We look forward to running through the slides with you today. Danya, if you can pop up the slides once again, that would be great. Okay. We got all the technology working and everything is great. So just in terms of housekeeping for anybody who's watching online, you'll be able to, if you're watching live through Zoom, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can ask a question. We are not allowing anonymous questions, but we are encouraging questions if you have. We don't really want to get into specific presentation, why is this percentage this or this percentage this. There is a final report coming, so I would ask that if you have, you can certainly type in the questions. We don't really have time to get into the specifics of individual questions today, but we'll be talking at the end of our presentation on what the next steps are, which I think will answer some of the questions. So without further ado, we'll get into our presentation. So again, my name is Ehud. I'm the Executive Director of the UCC, and we're thankful for your taking the time to join us this afternoon. This is presenting the preliminary overview results of the Community Engagement Survey, which the UCC undertook this past year. The overview report will reflect some of the initial findings, although as I just mentioned, this analysis is ongoing. Keith will speak to you about that. And the final report will be coming out in a number of weeks, we hope in early December. So again, if you use the Q&A function at the bottom, if you do have a question, we'd be happy to consider it with all the considerations of time. Next slide, please. Okay, about the project. So again, this is the first ever national survey of Ukrainian Canadians that's been conducted by the UCC. We conducted it in an online format for 6 weeks between May 22nd and June 30th. There were focus groups as well, which are sort of discussion panels about some of the specific themes that took place this fall. We really are thankful to the Temerite Foundation and the UCC Charitable and Educational Trust, which provided funding for this project. And we'd like to extend our appreciation of all the donors of UCC who've been supportive of us and all the people who took the time to participate in the survey as well. What are our objectives? So doing the survey, we had 4 objectives. To A, address the new challenges we know are going on in the community across Canada. This means talking about volunteerism, philanthropy, rates of involvement, organizations, structures, and integration of newcomers. Second, we wanted to create new opportunities for people from multiple perspectives to talk about what their needs are and desires and wishes are in involvement, programming, etc. Third, we want to continue to build inclusion and participation in the Ukrainian Canadian community. And we want to build engagement and participation. Sorry, I read those in the wrong order. So engagement and participation and promote inclusion. Survey themes. So for those of you who saw the survey or participated in the survey, you know that there were a number of questions. We had over 50 questions in 5 thematic blocks: Ukrainian Canadian identity and values, involvement in the Ukrainian community, participation in Ukrainian education, connection to Ukraine, and future participation in programming. Just wanted to introduce the team. Of course, I'm there as Executive Director. Tara Kutlusiak, who's with us today, was the project lead. Mariana Sauka, who's our outreach coordinator, was critical to the promotion of getting all of those answers, of those 4,000 answers. And Dr. Keith Neuman is with us today, who is our project consultant. And before I turn it over to Keith, I just wanted to, if you can punch up the next slide, Danya. Just wanted to briefly thank him for working with us on this project. This slide gives a little bit of his background. From our UCC team, it's certainly been invaluable working with you, Keith, to ensure that the project has been done at the highest level that we can while being done in-house. And so with that, we wanted to again welcome you to the Ukrainian community. You've been learning about all of our answers and our thoughts. And just before I turn it over, I wanted to talk about the survey outreach strategy. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we had over 4,000 respondents. We engage with internal stakeholders, which means the UCC branches, councils, member organizations. We engage with external stakeholders, which means businesses, arts and culture groups, schools, universities, and other external groups. We engaged with social media and through newsletters to get to a broader audience, as well as through online and community media. And we targeted social media particularly as a way to attract people who may not be otherwise involved or aware of the Ukrainian Canadian community. And basically, I can tell you that every effort was made to reach respondents not currently engaged or very loosely connected to our communities. And so that's why we're pleased to see this number as it is. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Keith Neuman to continue on with the presentation. Keith.
Great. Your next slide. Well, thank you, Yor, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this presentation and this project. So, as he indicated, the sampling for this survey was accomplished through outreach and circulation to the Ukrainian Canadian community through your very extensive networks and different media channels. This and some of you, I imagine, probably participated in the survey, so you would have some experience with it. It was self-administered. It was an online survey, the way most surveys are done today. There was a small handful, maybe 25 or 30, which were completed by telephone. These were with individuals who didn't have sufficient internet access, and we wanted to make sure that they could participate. So really the objective here was to reach a large sample of those who self-identify as Ukrainian or Ukrainian Canadian or as a Canadian with Ukrainian roots. As we know from the census 5 years ago, there are at least 1.4 million people who would fit this description. We wanted to speak with people 18 and over who were living in the country. So that in essence is the methodology. There are lots more details which are available, will be available in the final report when that gets issued. So next slide, please. So this is how it turned out. So in the end, over the period there when the survey was being sent out, over 4,000 completed surveys were received. That's a very healthy number. That's larger than most surveys that you will see in Canada or anywhere else. I think a typical survey of Canadians might be 1,500 or maybe 2,000. So this is really a very robust sample. And what's important is that there is good representation from every region of the country across age groups, gender, immigration wave, language, and so forth. And by the way, the survey was made available in English, French, and Ukrainian, so that helped. So really, it's a very large survey sample to work with. It's important to point out that it's not what's known as a probability sample. For those of you who know something about statistics, it can't be considered statistically representative of the Ukrainian Canadian population because the survey was not drawn from the population in a roughly random way. That is a bit of a gold standard for surveys. That approach in this case would have cost much more than what was available and might have been hard to justify. So because the survey was sent out through networks, people were invited to participate. It's not a probability sample. Nevertheless, the sample that we have, the 4,000 surveys, is a good representation because it has all of the relevant groups represented in reasonably strong numbers, and in many cases approximate what we would understand the population to be from the census number in terms of gender and region and that sort of thing. The final data, once it was collected, was weighted by province, since there are good benchmark numbers from the census to do that. So that involved some adjustments, but the adjustments weren't really that dramatic because the response to the survey was really so good. Next slide, please. Before we get into the detailed results, which are coming next, I thought I would make just a few initial observations of note to give you a sense of, I think, a few of the high points that we'll be seeing in the numbers. and a lot of some important aspects of the survey are about identity, Ukrainian Canadian identity. And I think it's very instructive, I think, and it may or may not be a surprise to those of you who know the community, that when we ask Ukrainian Canadians about their identity, almost all of them, well over 80%, say it's based equally on ancestry and culture. It's not one or the other. And that I think that's notable and may have some implications in terms of programming and steps forward. And I think what's also striking is this pattern, that the identity through both ancestry and culture is pretty consistent across the population by demography and province and linguistic categories. It's not split. And a second point, I think, that's worth pointing out, and again, this may or may not be surprising, but a significant number of people who took the survey put strong importance on their Ukrainian identity. It was very important to them. A strong sentiment, and again, this was pretty extensive across the population. We'll show you some numbers in a few minutes. And so I think that's also a very telling result. Also, what's interesting about identity is that a number of, quite a large number say that their identity has changed over the past 10 years, and they're more likely to say that it's strengthened and weakened. So for those who are concerned that the Ukrainian identity and sense of connection is sort of waning because that's what happens when groups come to Canada and assimilate, certainly in the survey, we're not seeing strong evidence of that. As you might expect, the language, either mother tongue or the language in one's household today, is a significant factor when it comes to identity and involvement, connection, much more so than region or age, gender, or even immigration wave. So again, those of you that know the community, this may confirm what you expect, or it may be a surprise. And the final point, maybe to emphasize, is volunteer activity in this community among the people we surveyed is really quite robust. While it doesn't include everybody, there are very significant numbers of people who were involved. So there'll be more on some of these points shortly. And Tara, over to you.
Okay, so the main purpose of the following section on demographic profiles is to demonstrate the results of our outreach process. For this reason that we're presenting all the numbers in the section as unweighted raw percentages. As Keith has already mentioned, we're happy to say that we've had excellent coverage across every demographic group, including region, age, gender, generation in Canada, immigration wave, and linguistic category. And again, as Keith has also mentioned, survey sample is not intended to be statistically representative of the entire Ukrainian Canadian population, but the large size of the sample combined with the fact that we have representation in every major demographic category gives us a very useful set of data for our purposes. So starting with region, we're very happy to see responses from every single province and territory from across the country. Ontario, not surprisingly, has the largest percentage of responses at 40%, followed by Alberta and Manitoba at 18% and 17% respectively. BC and Saskatchewan are sitting at 9% and Quebec at 6%. Atlantic provinces as well as territories all had representation around 1%. With respect to age, we had solid representation of every age category, virtually evenly split between millennials in the 24 to 39 category, the Gen Xers in the 40 to 55 category, and the boomers in the 56 to 74 category. Also solid representation of the 75 above at 12%. And just a note on the last category, the 18 to 23-year-olds, getting respondents in the youngest age category in surveys is notoriously difficult, but with the help of our youth leaders, we got 6% of the total, which we thought was excellent. The gender breakdown was similar, very similar in fact, to that of our social media audience, which tends to split slightly higher on the female side. In this case was 61% compared to the male at 38%. So as Ihor mentioned earlier, one of the main objectives of our survey outreach was to reach a significant segment of the unengaged or unaffiliated Ukrainian Canadian population. So we measured level of engagement by question 22, which asks respondents during the last 5 years, have you been an active member of a Ukrainian Canadian organization or charity? We were pleased to see approximately 35% of respondents fit into this unengaged or unaffiliated category. So this includes people who said they were not an active member currently, or and it also included people who said they used to be, but also are not currently. So Generation Canada, this question shows approximately equal representation from each of the 3 major generations, about 30% or so each for first generation, second generation, and third or higher Ukrainian Canadians. Now, immigration wave. This question shows very good coverage for each of the main waves of Ukrainian immigrants. We had 23% of respondents were from the first wave, 13% from the second, 25% from the third, 13% from, 3% from the Polish immigration of the 1960s, 1970s, about 5% from the fourth, and 17% from the fifth, which is the most recent. Given that some waves have had significantly more immigrants than other waves, it perhaps isn't surprising to see these variations in percentages, but we're still very happy with the representation that we have. Single or multiple ethnic origin. So this question is one that is also asked on the Canadian census. And for the sake of comparison, we could see that the number of Ukrainian Canadians of single ethnic origin in our survey is a fair bit higher than it is in the general Ukrainian Canadian population. So it's about 69% in our survey population compared to 20% of the general population as measured in the 2016 census. So household language and mother tongue, a very interesting slide. So to get at language use, we asked 2 key questions. As you can see, we have pretty different results. In the mother tongue question, when we asked what was your first language spoken, 64% of respondents said that it was Ukrainian. In the second question, when we asked what the main language spoken in your household was, only 30% responded Ukrainian. So at this point, I will turn it back over to Keith to go into some of the data for the first section on Ukrainian Canadian identity and values.
Thank you, Tara. If you could move to the next slide. So I mentioned this briefly and before, and I'm going to give you a bit more detail here. So this was a question about the basis of people's Ukrainian Canadian identity. And as we can see, about 82% said it's equally a matter of culture and ancestry. Relatively few, 10% or less, said it was primarily ancestry. And I might point out that doesn't mean that they might not say a little bit as culture, but it's sort of mainly, and then mainly a matter of ancestry 10% and culture 6%. So I think this is notable. And as I indicated, this high sort of identity based on both is pretty consistent across age groups, which I think might be a bit surprising. Region, immigration wave, generation in Canada. Again, one might have expected that the longer you're in the country, perhaps the culture part might diminish some, but we're not seeing evidence of that. In terms of the generations, first, second, third, it ranges from 79 to 81%. So very, very close. Next slide, please. So importance of being Ukrainian. Again, as Terry indicated, we are more likely to have sort of single ethnic origin people in our sample than maybe in the population. But nevertheless, 68% of the people we surveyed say that being Ukrainian or Ukrainian Canadian is very important. And almost everyone else say it's at least somewhat important. Very few say it's not very important at all. And this, again, this is a sort of a majority response. It's slightly smaller among 18 to 23-year-olds, it's 60%, but really that's not much lower. Second generation, it's 59%. That's really not much lower. And I think that surprisingly, even among those people in our sample who say they have no local Ukrainian Canadian community where they live, it's still 56%. So this importance placed in identity does not seem to be sort of limited to those that have sort of a strong local community. The only group that really doesn't sort of meet this kind of benchmark or this high level of importance is that small proportion, about 10% of our sample, for whom only ancestry is the basis of their identity. So we can go to the next slide, please. So we presented about 10 or 12 different aspects or attributes of being Ukrainian Canadian or being Ukrainian, and said how essential is each one of these to you in terms of what it means to be part of this identity. And what we're showing you here is just the proportion that say essential. Almost everybody else said these were at least important at some level. But what really distinguishes these is those who say it's essential to them. And if you can read this, you can get a sense of it. But there are three at the top that are most likely, around 60%, celebrating Ukrainian holidays such as Christmas and Easter, caring and knowing about the history and the experience of Ukrainians in Canada, and caring about Ukraine. So those 60% of our sample said those were essential. And then you can see how it goes from there. There are three that are least likely to meet this criterion: being able to speak Ukrainian, which is around 30-some%, active involvement in Ukrainian Canadian organizations and projects. Obviously, not everybody's involved in that, and being involved in faith-based activities. So these results are pretty similar. If you want to go back, Tara, just one more comment. The results here are pretty similar across the population, but there are some interesting age differences. As you might expect, older Ukrainian Canadians are more likely to place emphasis on being part of a community, speaking Ukrainian, and being involved in faith-based activities. But it's the youngest cohort, 18 to 23-year-olds, who are most likely to put an emphasis on remembering historical events and caring about Ukraine. So I think some of the results are a bit counterintuitive. Okay, next slide, please. What about the impact of one's identity on one's own personal values? A very significant proportion, 55% to a great extent, 37% somewhat, over 90%, say that their identity shapes or influences their personal values. And again, this is something that we see across the population. As you might expect, a strong impact of identity is linked to connection to a local community, how strong your identity is, whether or not you speak Ukrainian. So there are some factors that play a part in terms of the extent to which people feel their values are shaped by this identity. Next. We also asked a question about values that people feel reflect their personal values as Ukrainian Canadian or someone with similar roots. It's quite a long list. I think there are about 20 types of values that we put on the survey, and people could select them or not. At the top of the list, strong work ethic, respect for other people, and hospitality. Those are 2/3 or more identified those. And then we go through the list. I'm not going to read them all. At the bottom of the list, creativity, humility, civic engagement, and dependability. These are very broad values, of course. All are significant, although there's some variation. Obviously, some hit a nerve more than others. And across the population, the top three you see here are the top three across all of the groups. So we don't really see a lot of group differences in terms of what values are most stated for a question like this. Next slide. We also asked a question about whether people's strength of their Ukrainian Canadian identity has changed over the last 10 or so years. What's happened in their lives for various reasons. About 50% say yes, it has changed. And the other 50% said no, or really couldn't be sure. And then we asked those people, well, for those, the 50% for whom it changed, how did it change? And did it get stronger or weaker? And what we see is of that 50%, 60% of them, or over half, said their Ukrainian Canadian identity is actually stronger than it was before. They said things like they were more engaged, they were more involved in the community, they've learned about the history and heritage. So this was an open-ended question, and those are the sorts of responses. 37% of this group said their identity was now weaker, less involved, more assimilated, loss of language, the sorts of things that we might see. And that sort of detail is in the numbers, and we'll bring out in our report. So at this point, I'm going to turn things back over to Tara to take you through the next section. Tara?
Okay, so the next segment covers the area of membership in organizations, volunteerism, and philanthropy. So the first question covers the question of baseline involvement in the Ukrainian community, very broadly defined as, we broadly defined an active member as someone who's registered, enrolled, or on a mailing list, or part of a regular meeting or activity in a Ukrainian Canadian organization. And 59% of respondents said yes. So for the respondents who said no to the previous question, we then asked, what is the main reason or reasons for not being a member in the last 5 years? Of course, as you might expect, lack of time and other priorities are at the top of the list. They're at about 33% each. But in terms of other considerations, the top consideration was no organized Ukrainian community where I live at 18%, and inability to make a longer term commitment, which was also at 18%. A couple others above the 10% mark were lack of interest at 13% and didn't feel welcome at 10%. So then we got into volunteering. This question actually yielded similar results to the question of membership. The percentages are just a few points lower, at 56% of respondents saying they had volunteered in the last 5 years. And then we asked which of the following considerations were most important in deciding to volunteer. These answers are quite interesting. By far, the most important was that people felt that they could contribute to the community. It's at 76% of respondents, and a close second being the organization having a cause they cared about at 73%. So those were the top two considerations for volunteering. Third, trailing behind at 50%, was being able to use my skills. And then notably, the need for personal connection with others was at 32%. And the reason I mentioned that one is because it was also part of some of the key themes that emerged from our focus groups that we conducted this fall. So all of these reasons we heard in multiple focus groups. Next slide. So then we asked a question, in the last 5 years, have you considered volunteering for a Ukrainian Canadian organization or charity, but in the end chose not to do so? So 26%, or about a quarter of all respondents said that they had considered volunteering and then did not end up doing so. And then thinking back to those situations, we asked what was the main reason or reasons why you didn't end up volunteering. Once again, lack of time and other priorities topped the list. But aside from time issues, we identified, I didn't feel welcome at 22%, did not know how to get involved at 18%, and no one asked at 13%. So financial donations to Ukrainian causes. We asked in the last 5 years, have you or someone in your household made a donation to Ukrainian Canadian organization? And a full 70% of those surveyed said that they had. We then asked for reasons for financial donations, motivations. So we actually asked 2 separate questions. One was for respondents who said that they had donated, and one asked people who had not donated the hypothetical question, if you were to, what might prompt you? So I found it quite notable that the answers were the same in both questions. So the actual answers and the hypothetical answers, or reasons rather, were the same. So number 1 by far was the organization having a cause I care about at 78%. A fairly distant second was contributing to the community at 57%, and trust in the organization also at 57%. And then knowing how my gift is being used was at 47%. Most of the other reasons were a bit further down the list. Recognition was very low at under 10%. So I thought that was an interesting thing to note. So connection to one's local Ukrainian community, we asked how connected respondents felt to the local Ukrainian community in the city, town, or village where they lived. About 25%, or a quarter of respondents, felt very connected. 35% feel somewhat connected, and about 20% said not very, and 13% not at all. So we then asked respondents to identify the main reason or reasons they do not feel more connected. So this is a bit of a positive response at first. 36% of respondents said they were happy with the current level of connection and therefore did not need to be connected in a greater way. And then of course you have the time constraint issue at 22%. And then some of the other reasons of note: haven't found Ukrainian programs or activities that I like at 14%, don't know people in the community also at 14%, and don't speak the language at 10%. All of the other reasons out of these dozen or so that we identified were under 10%, so not as noteworthy. So language fluency as a barrier to inclusion. So in this question, we asked to what degree, if any, respondents felt that a lack of language fluency, either in English, Ukrainian, or French, or any other language that they chose to identify, had been an obstacle to membership or inclusion in a Ukrainian Canadian organization. So adding up anyone who said that it had been to either a small, moderate, or high degree, there's 37% who identified it as a barrier. And then as of those, 80%, so a fairly big majority, said it was their lack of Ukrainian language ability that had been the barrier, versus 14% who said that it was English and 1% who said that it was French. I should mention this was also a key theme that emerged in the qualitative data. So in each of the 6 focus groups that we conducted in September, participants identified this as an issue needing to be addressed. Okay, so interest in becoming more connected. We asked respondents how interested they were, if at all, in becoming more connected to the local Ukrainian community where they lived. So about 64% said they were very interested or somewhat interested. And then we asked specifically which kinds of Ukrainian programs or activities they would most like to take advantage of if they were available. And topping the list was cultural activities, so things like dance, arts, movies, plays, and concerts. Second was educational programming, so lectures, conferences, talks, book clubs. That was at 48%. And then third was social activities, so charitable and sports at 43%. This is a similar question, but with asked from a slightly different perspective. What types of Ukrainian experiences are most important to you or your family? So not so much programming, but experiences, personal experiences. And this is goes back to some of the questions that we asked earlier, where respondents said that holidays in particular were of great importance to them. So celebrating Ukrainian holidays, 76% of respondents said it was the most important Ukrainian experience. Second was upholding traditions and customs. And then family gatherings was the third most important at 51%. I should also mention visiting Ukraine was also quite high in this list at 44%. Okay, at this junction, I will turn it over to Ihor, who will discuss participation in Ukrainian education.
Great, thank you, Tara. So we did have a specific section on Ukrainian education. So just a couple of questions to run through. So first was participation in a Ukrainian school. The question was, have you ever attended a Ukrainian school, public, Catholic, evening, weekend, etc.? So trying to be holistic about it. So again, 48% of people told us that they had attended some kind of a school. Interestingly, 36% of people said that their children had attended a Ukrainian school, either day or evening kind of thing. So that's an interesting, a bit of a drop there. Next slide, please. Participation in Ukrainian cultural education. So we define cultural education as youth groups, dance groups, music groups, Sunday schools, try to be as broad as possible about it. So again, you can see 64% of our survey respondents said they themselves had participated in this kind of educational or artistic program, and slightly 1% more said that their children had participated in this kind of educational or artistic program. And as Tara mentioned earlier, we had asked about connection to Ukraine, so we have a couple of specific slides that explored that a little bit further. So emotional attachment to Ukraine. So this is where we asked people, how connected do you feel to Ukraine? So again, you can see the charts on the left, and our overview is that 75% of our survey respondents said they felt very connected or somewhat connected to Ukraine. And that was, again, as Keith was mentioning earlier, it was some of our other findings consistently high across regions and across age groups. We did ask people specifically if they had been to Ukraine or how often they had been to Ukraine, or if they were born in Ukraine. So again, you can see the numbers there on the left. And again, we've summarized it to say 66% of those surveyed had been to Ukraine at least once. And we're including that in those numbers, those who were born there, but quite significantly, a large number had never, 34% had never visited, but it's interesting to compare that to the earlier numbers when you're looking at the attachment or the involvement. Okay, Tara, back to you on perspectives for the future.
Okay, so in this section, we asked a number of questions related to future vision of respondents. And I just wanted to mention that some of the open-ended questions will be discussed later on in the final report. So we're just, this is the main question. It was probably one of the most interesting out of the closed-ended questions in this section. We asked respondents, when thinking about what is of the greatest importance to the Ukrainian community as a whole, what specific areas should organizations focus most on developing? And we asked them to select up to 3 in order to have respondents prioritize what they felt was most important. So topping the list once again, as we've seen in many other questions, arts, culture, and folk programs came out on top at 66%. Second were programs for children and youth at 56%, and then Ukrainian language education programs at 55%. I should probably mention support for newcomers was also at a pretty solid percentage at 33%, and then charitable causes in Ukraine close by at 29%. Okay, at this junction, that wraps up the 5 key themes, and I'll leave some final thoughts to Keith.
Thank you, Tara. So just a couple of quick comments about what you've seen and what you might make of it. So we've shown you quite a few results and numbers. The data is actually quite valuable, but just Just a bit of a caution not to worry too much about all the detailed numbers. It's not the full story. The actual numbers are not the full story. I think a good way to think about the data is it's the evidence from which we'll pull out what's most important information and insights. I think there's always a danger looking at survey numbers to get really deep into all the percentages and the differences. There's a bigger picture here, and really what we're going to be focusing on is the broad patterns and the key insights that we can bring out of this, because ultimately any survey needs to tell a story. And we are going to be preparing a more comprehensive final report, which will tell that story and provide a lot of the details that I imagine some of you are very interested to see. So with that, I think, Dior, back to you.
Great. Well, I know my head's spinning with all the charts and facts and numbers that I've just seen. So, and I had seen this chart before, so I can only imagine for those who've seen it for the first time that they've been scribbling down furiously. So I think we want to emphasize, again, as Keith said and Tara said, this is the first overview presentation. We wanted to share it with you today with delegates of our AGM and other leaders to give you a sense of what we've learned. We are working with Keith on a final report, which we anticipate coming out in the next month or two. Again, we don't have a specific date, but we're working very diligently to have that. The final report will, of course, include these kinds of charts and percentages, but also some more analysis about the correlations that have been mentioned. We are very happy to be working with member organizations of the UCC, national member organizations, quite a number of whom assisted us in getting the information out about the survey to their members and to their local branches. And so those member organizations will be getting the set of their data as well from this. And then our role here as the survey team is to support our local branches, provincial councils, and member organizations who will be reviewing the survey results based on the final report. There's obviously going to be, the final report will be even longer than this presentation, and a lot in there for people to see and to think about. And so what we are offering from our team, from our office, from the UCC National perspective, is to work with you to identify opportunities, whether it's presentations or sort of conversations, to talk about how each of our components and branches can have their own discussion about the survey review, what people have seen in it, what they might take away in terms of the work that they're doing. And finally, obviously UCC National, which has managed the survey, presented the survey project, we are going to be undertaking a strategic planning exercise based on the final report as well. So that's being led by our executive and our board. And again, we can't begin until the final survey is completed, but already I can tell you that many of the themes are really getting people's interest in terms of thinking how do we sort of, especially in times of COVID, bring together people to make progress and discuss some of these key issues. So there'll be much more to say on that part. We do have a little bit of time. It's been a long day for some of you and for some of us, but we've got a little bit of time for questions. I only see one question right now. I did want to particularly mention a special thanks to Danya Vasilik, who's off camera today, who's done an excellent job with the slide presentation, working with Tara and Keith. I wanted to thank our entire UCC staff team who've all been working to support the work that Tara and Mariana and Keith are doing. And of course, to thank all of you who participated in the survey, all of you who assisted us in getting the survey out there to a wide number of people. We were very nervous heading into this kind of project, not knowing what to expect, and have been very pleasantly surprised by your support and your contribution directly along the way at every step of the way. So, okay, question number one is well done, great job. So, okay, we'll take that as answered. Thank you, Irena. Question number two, somebody looks forward to seeing the final question. Great. Question number three. Okay, this is from our friends at Kius. So again, congratulating us. And can we elaborate on the post 1991 immigrants, fourth or fifth wave, as survey categories. And I know this is a question that Kius is doing some academic research on now. Tara, do you have that at hand in terms of how we split that up, or is that something we can talk to Dr. Hanenko-Friesen about later offline?
I think that would be something we can talk about offline. I do have my data tables at hand, but I'm not sure. I don't have the exact numbers handy at the moment. So yeah, we can certainly follow up after the meeting.
Sure. So Dr. Hanenko-Friesen from Kius, we're happy to talk with you. And again, her and her team are doing really interesting research into post-1991 immigration to Canada, and they've talked to us about it, and there's been some interesting findings there as well. So I think we did realize that we sort of talk about post-91 as the fourth wave, and then sort of more contemporary being a fifth wave. And where that line is exactly is, I'm sure, up for debate, but we'll follow up with you, Dr. Hanenko-Friesen, on that. And again, I just wanted to thank Keith for his support as a consultant in developing the questions, because we've heard a lot of really interesting feedback on the questions as well. And I think just in developing the questions and reviewing the questions, that was quite an interesting exercise on its own. There was just one more question here before we wrap up on response bias mitigation. Keith, I don't know how would you respond to that? What would you say to that?
Response bias. Sorry, I'm just reading the question. Yeah.
So it's about those who
are. This is a big. There's no simple answer, I think, to this question. I think that, as I indicated, this survey was circulated through networks, and it was what we call an opt-in survey. In other words, we put it out there and people were able to answer it, rather than us going out and selecting people from the community. So as I said, it can't be considered a probability sample and strictly representative of the population, even though those methods are less than perfect. So obviously there would be some bias, if you will, or some differences in terms of the people choosing to participate. So clearly, I think maybe one way to characterize the sample, it's not strictly representative of all Ukrainian Canadians, but it's probably a pretty good representation of that, the large segment of that population that has some connection or identity or something to the community. And probably, and I think we spoke to this briefly, I think it's probably represents a little more connected part of the population than everyone. But that being said, we also have people in our survey who are not connected. So we do have them represented. We may not have as many of them as in the population would suggest. And I think we need to acknowledge that. But I think what's important is we have enough people who don't have connection or identity to look at their responses and understand how people in those groups respond to the questions.
That's a great answer, and I think you described it in an earlier conversation to me about community learning as a process, because when we started the process, there weren't really any. Well, there were no examples in our community, and we've certainly used a few examples from other ethnocultural communities to compare against and to use, but there isn't a lot of work being done in this field. And again, we're thankful to our friends at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. We've also worked with Dr. Oleg Volovina from North Carolina, who came and spoke at our last triennial Congress and got us interested and embarking on this process of the demographic work, similar to what he's done in the US. So we are very much engaged in the process of community learning, and again, thankful to the Temarté Foundation and the UCC Trust for supporting that. And I think, again, the final report will contain more information, more analysis than what we've presented today. But certainly, I think today gives you a slice of the many different things we can think about if we're community leaders, if we're volunteers. There'll be a lot in this report that we hope to be of use to organizations and individuals in the work that they do and the planning that they're doing. And it's not, not necessarily a short-term thing in terms of next week, next month, but thinking ahead, even potentially to some of the triennial Congress type work, et cetera. So with that, I don't see any other questions other than people saying they're looking forward to the final report. We are as well, and we'll be keeping in touch with our leadership on it. So again, thank you to Keith and Tara for being with us today and for their diligent work, to Danya for the excellent slide presentation. And many people will be seeing this as a recording. Not everybody was able to join us, so we'll be sending this out to people who weren't able to join us on this nice Saturday afternoon. But thank you to everybody who did, and we appreciate your interest and engagement. And again, our final report will be coming out early December, late November, and we will keep all of our stakeholders engaged. So, na dobranic, do powodzenia.